we should say that we did. Or the bonding is a section of order. I don't know.
It's like alright. We were wrong. Oh, okay. It's just the left of that. St. John's. Yes, that's okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, well, means we'll get a
So where did we get up to last time? Is it Sarah went down to Egypt, I think was the last thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. I think the last slide I think was the terrorist family moved around.
Okay.
So,
Can I do that one down?
oh no, we did Abraham, Sarah and Pharaoh, didn't we?
Yeah, I think so.
No, that was the last one.
5:15.
Are you plugged in? Is it?
I'm plugged in. Perhaps I need to check the display thing. Actually, I haven't done this yet.
Yeah, I've set it up.
Okay. Okay, so just carry on then from last week. You all right there, Sabaya? Can't quite see you there behind Andrew. Can't see you there behind Andrew. No, Andrew, don't move. No. So
It's okay. I'm right here.
all right. Okay. Okay, so we're looking at Abraham. So Abraham then was the big picture then is that God wants to save humanity. In order to send humanity, God needs to send the Messiah. But in order for God to be able to send the Messiah, there has to be conditions need to be made to create a foundation to receive the Messiah. And those conditions are that the foundation of faith and the foundation of substance that Adam and Eve didn't make need to be restored. And so the central figures has to restore the foundation of faith and the foundation of substance and restore the sorts of things that went on in Adam's family. And restoration means making a condition of damage to reverse what went wrong. Yeah, so we looked there last week at the end there of how Sarah was able to make that condition not to give in to the temptation from Pharaoh, as Eve did with Lucifer, but to overcome that temptation. And so Abraham was able to reclaim Sarah from Pharaoh, as if Adam was reclaiming Eve from Lucifer, from Satan, and also reclaimed Lot representing humanity. And as I said, the Pharaoh gave them loads of wealth, which represented the creation. And so Abraham then, he stands in the position of Adam and in the position of Noah, and has to make this, he has to demonstrate the same faith that Adam had, the same faith that Noah had. So let's have a look at Abraham's faith in God then. Okay, so God said to Abraham one day, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them." So how many stars are there?
100 billion times 100 billion.
100 billion times 100 billion.
That's my last count, yeah.
Your last count, and you counted them up on your fingers, or?
It's an algorithm to calculate.
Okay, so basically it's numberless. Nobody can count them. Yeah? Nobody. And certainly not on your fingers. Anyway, so God said to him, "Look towards heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So what do you think of that then? How many stars are there? Countless numbers, billions. And God said to Abraham, so will your descendants be. And Abraham believed. Is that an easy thing to believe or a difficult thing to believe?
Difficult thing to believe.
You know, you're an old man. His 80s, 90s, I forget now. His wife, the same sort of age, a bit younger than him. No children. And then God said, your descendants will number the stars of heaven. And he believed him. So why did Abraham believe what God said?
Foundation of faith. Yes.
Sorry?
I don't know. Foundation of faith, like.
Okay, he had faith. So what does that mean then, to have faith? Is it believing in possible things?
No.
What's faith based upon, Sune? Faith is belief. It's partly it's belief, but what is one believing?
Things that are not normally possible.
Sorry?
Things that are only possible by your own power.
No.
God.
Hmm?
In God.
Yeah. Why should one believe in God then? What we looked at this. We looked at Abraham's faith. We looked at faith a lot, and we explained what faith is about. What's faith based upon? Hmm? Logic or reason? Yes.
Experience.
Reason and experience. Okay. So why should Abraham? This is when we looked at this story last week of how Abraham discovered God. Remember, he worked it out for himself. He found God. It's not that God called him or God found him, but actually he found God. Worked it out logically. Where did he come from, etc., etc. Cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. There must be a beginning. Has to start it off somewhere, and that is God, and that's what he believed in. So his faith then in God was based upon logic. It's based upon reason. To Abraham, the most reasonable explanation for the most reasonable way of explaining why there is a world, why there's a universe, is that there is a God that created it. It didn't come from nowhere. Most rational, most logical explanation is God exists. Yeah? And also based on experience. And so when we say we have faith in a person, part of it's about trust. Why do you trust somebody? Because you believe that person is trustworthy. Why do you believe they're trustworthy? Because of experience. You know that person's never let you down. So that's why you trust them. Yeah. So faith then is based upon reason, logic, something you know it's true. That's why I believe it. You look at an aeroplane taking off, you think, well, that's impossible. How can things that are heavier than air fly? Well, it's based upon the laws of aerodynamics and physics. And if you know the laws of physics, and etc., 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 you know it is quite logical why an aeroplane flies. It's not unbelievable, it's not impossible, it's not superstition to believe that aeroplanes can fly. Yeah? It's logical, it's based upon reason, yeah? And also based upon... So if we look at Abraham's faith in God then, first of all, he knew God existed, based on logic, and also from his own personal experience, he knew God was almighty, he knew God was powerful, he trusted God. So when God said this, he figured to himself, well, God created the universe. Because God created the universe, surely it's possible for this to happen, for me to have millions and billions of descendants. If God created the universe, nothing is outside of God's power in that sense. And also from his own personal experience, he trusted God. He knew if God said something, yeah. And so that was the basis of his faith then. So let's have a look at the next bit. So complete faith in God then. Anyway, move on to the next verse. Then God said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. This land, the land of Canaan, to possess. But, he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? So what do you think of that then? What do you think about his response here?
He's saying he believed it, but then he's saying, can you prove it to me that it's going to happen?
Okay, so he's saying but. So if you say but, what does that usually imply? Doubt, doesn't it? But how can I know I should possess it? In other words, I want proof. I want evidence. In other words, at that point, for some reason, he wasn't able to have faith. Yes? That makes sense? He didn't say, oh, that's wonderful, I believe. But actually, he said, but how can I know? I need some evidence, I need some proof. So in that sense, he lost faith. So if you lose faith, what do you need to do?
Gain it somehow.
You need to restore it. And so he had to restore this foundation of faith. Okay, so this is why he had to make this foundation of faith, to restore this doubt. And then God said to him, right, so this is what I want you to do. I want you to bring let's see if I got the verses here. No, I haven't. Anyway, God said to him, I want you to bring and offer me a heifer, a ram and a goat, a dove and a pigeon. And so this is the offering that God asked Abraham to bring to restore the foundation of faith. And so the foundation of faith then requires a central figure, that was Abraham, and the symbolic object. And so this object then represented the cosmos, just as Noah, just as the offering that Cain and Abel made represented the creation, and just as the ark that Noah built represented the creation, so also these offerings represented the creation. So just as Noah's ark had 3 stories, so here you've got 3 different levels of the creation. You've got the foundation, formation stage, a dove and a pigeon, growth stage, ram and a goat, and the completion stage, a heifer. Yeah? And also can be thought of as representing the Old, New and completed Testament ages. As a dove and a pigeon, why do you think you got 2 in the first 2 stages and only 1 in the top stage?
Because the heifer is quite huge. It's not one hard working really. In fact, I always say one thing, I feel that the intellectuality and spirituality of people in that period must have been very low. Because in reality, Abraham should have started from the bottom instead of from the top. And because he spent so much time putting the ever and got a lot of energy, by the time he got to the ram and he got to he was tired.
He was certainly tired, yeah, he was an old man.
Yes.
Anyway, so often we talk about that Satan invaded at the top of the growth stage. So in that sense, the completion stage wasn't invaded by Satan, so that's why he only had 1. So we think about a dove and a pigeon. A dove is like a symbol of peace. And what kind of bird is a pigeon?
A flying rat.
Yes. It's a messy, dirty bird. You know, makes such a mess at Trafalgar Square. Yeah, it's that kind of a bird. What about a ram and a goat? How they differ? What's a ram represent?
Both male, right? Ram and goat.
Goat is just a species, name of the species. The ram is certainly male, yes. They're 2 different species. What does a ram, do you think that represents?
Masculine.
It's masculine. Any others? What species does a ram belong to? Sheep, okay.
Oh, the lamb of Hashem was God's.
Sorry?
The lamb of Hashem of God's right hand side of the goats.
Very good, Sunny. So if you remember the Day of Judgment, Jesus said the king, God, will separate the sheep from the goats. Yes? And so sheep then is like represents the good side and the goats represent the bad side. Yeah? And then if you remember, Jesus was described as the Lamb of the world. Behold the Lamb of the world that takes away the sins of the world. So it's like, and then as I said, just as in the formation stage you got the good and the bad, in the growth stage you got the good and the bad. And it's also the dove represents the Old Testament age. So when John the Baptist baptized Jesus, then a dove appeared, yes, representing the Old Testament, him receiving and inheriting the whole Old Testament foundation through being baptized by Jesus. So that's that.
Don't the Jews also blow a ram's horn to signify heaven coming?
Sorry?
Don't the Jews also blow a ram's horn for some kind of signifying heaven coming?
They do, but that comes later, the meaning of that. Yes?
Well, I'm just thinking to myself that maybe the reason why there's only one animal, which is the heifer, is that Satan only invaded the first 2 stages.
That's right.
And that's why good and evil has to be resolved. The information of the God,
Yes.
you know.
Yeah.
But Baptist state it didn't invade, so that's why they
That's right.
one animal.
Exactly, exactly. And the heifer then is a female, is a cow, female, of that species, and so represents marriage and blessing. And so what he needed to do then, he needed to cut these animals up into two. So it's like separating good and bad, separating good from good and bad, good and evil, and letting blood drain out. And so he cut up the heifer, he cut up the ram and the goat, but he didn't cut up the dove and the pigeon. Okay, and so as Tobias said, you can imagine he's an old man, and in the Bible it says that he just fell asleep. He was obviously tired. And it's, can you imagine, they didn't have the sort of sharp knives in those days. What age was this?
Was it Bronze Age?
Maybe it's Stone Age, maybe. I mean, as far as I know, they didn't have metal at that time.
Maybe he used flint.
Yes. Do you think that was easy or hard?
Or obsidian, something like that.
I don't know.
Difficult, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's hard work. Didn't have an electric saw, as the butchers do nowadays. It was really hard work, and he was a really old man. And so, it's not good to judge him, but just to feel, compassion that he really tried his best. It wasn't that he lost faith, it's just that he just became tired, and maybe needed to, plan it a little bit differently or get some help, I don't know.
So was it a measurement of his passion?
Sorry?
Was it some kind of way of God measuring his passion? If he'd had more passion, maybe he would have generated more energy, something like that?
I don't know. I mean, it represented all sorts of things. This is a very important offering. And it also represented, restoring this 400 years that went before. It was just an incredibly important offering or gift that he needed to give. But it said there, he did not cut the birds in two, and when birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. These birds of prey symbolize or represent Satan wanting to invade the offering and to claim it. And so dividing something in two, this is just the normal way in which people in the Middle East would make a deal. They'd make a contract they'd cut an animal in two, they'd sit between it, and they'd close a deal. That's just the way a covenant was made. And then God said to him, your descendants will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. So you might think, do you think that's fair or unfair? God said to him, your descendants will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years.
Was the word enslaved? Because sometimes they use sojourners, which means like just traveling in a land which is not their own. Enslaved is a bit more extreme.
Well, anyway, they'll be sojourners in a foreign land, so they go to a foreign country, and they'll be enslaved, mistreated for 400 years.
Sounds a bit, overreacting.
It sounds rather harsh, doesn't it? So why is it so harsh? So what's going on here? Okay, so as we looked at before, when you make a foundation of faith, this foundation of faith determines ownership, decides whether you belong to God or you belong to Satan. So both God and Satan were watching to see what was Abraham going to do. Because it's like a sort of an agreement, like a sort of deal between God and Satan. And the deal was like this. If Abraham made this offering successfully, then God will be able to give an extraordinary blessing to Abraham and his descendants, and they'll be able to live in the land of Canaan for 400 years. And they've been blessed by God and become incredibly prosperous. So if you remember the question Abraham said, how am I to know that my descendants are going to possess this land? If he made the offering successfully, then his descendants would have possessed this land and prospered there for 400 years. But Satan said, okay, if he doesn't make it successfully, then I can have them for 400 years. And instead of living in Canaan for 400 years, they're going to live somewhere else for 400 years, and I can do my worst to try and break their faith. Yeah? And so that's what Satan tried to do. He tried to destroy the Hebrews, the descendants of Abraham, so that after 400 years there'd be nobody left to take out of Egypt into Canaan. He's trying to destroy their sense of identity. And so that's what happened during this period of slavery. When the Egyptian Pharaoh said he wanted to make all the Hebrews into slaves, the Hebrews had a choice. They could either remain Hebrews and keep their identity, even if it meant being turned into slaves, or they could say, well, actually, I think I'll take out Egyptian citizenship, please, and then I can be like everybody else. Yeah, so they had that choice. And if they'd all assimilated and all become Egyptians, then after 400 years there'd be nobody left to bring out of Egypt into Canaan. So that's this 400-year period they had to restore the foundation of faith. Yeah? Which meant keeping their faith even through incredible difficulty, even through incredible suffering. They still need to maintain their faith in God. Even when everything seemed to be going wrong, they still need to keep their faith in God because they knew God was real. So in that sense, this condition was like a condition of lesser indemnity. If Abraham had made it successfully, this small offering, then he could have received a huge blessing from God. Because he didn't make it, then it became a condition of greater indemnity. So to restore that small offering, they had to go through a period of 400 years so they could get back to the beginning, going back into Canaan, which is where they were supposed to be in the first place. God said to Abraham, you and your descendants will live in Canaan, and that's what was supposed to happen. Unfortunately, Abraham had some doubts, then he didn't make the offering successfully, then they went out for 400 years through this difficult time, and then finally after 400 years they could get back to the starting point again. It's a bit like snakes and ladders. Yeah? You get all this way up and zoop, and you've got to work really hard to get back to that position again. Okay, that makes sense? Any questions? Yeah, so that offering then was incredible. It has many, many meanings. And because it represented all sorts of things, then because it wasn't made successfully, then Satan could invade all those things that would have been restored otherwise by that small gift, that small offering. Okay, at this stage then, Abraham is 85 years old. His wife Sarah, she's 76 years old, and she's well past having children. And so, you can imagine then Abraham and Sarah wondering, how is God's promise to us going to happen, come about? And so Sarah said to Abraham, look, this is my maid, Hagar. She belongs to me. Under the laws of that time, if a slave had a child, that child would belong to the slave owner. And so Sarah said, I can't have a child. So Abraham, why don't you have a child? Why don't we have a child through Hagar? Yes, and then the child that Hagar gives birth to, that'll be our child. Yeah, so people do that nowadays, don't they? What do they call it? Surrogate mothers, yeah? And so Hagar, in that sense, was like the surrogate mother, except without the test tubes and everything else. And so Sarah offered her maid to Abraham, and Abraham slept with Hagar, and eventually Hagar then became pregnant. So what do you think about that then? Is that moral or immoral?
Moral, I guess, because she wanted to get a child, right? And Abraham was the child. So.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, according to the laws of that time, that was an accepted custom. It wasn't immoral. It wasn't Abraham who's taking the initiative. He wasn't thinking, well, my wife, she's getting a bit old and ugly, but she's got a really pretty maid. Yes? I'm going to sleep with her really pretty maid. Yes? So the initiative then didn't come from Abraham. It wasn't out of lust that he had this relationship with Hagar. It wasn't him that's taking the initiative, but actually it was Sarah who organised it. It was Sarah that took the initiative. It was Sarah's plan as a way that she could have a child. Yes? Or Abraham and her could have a child. So in that sense, Abraham didn't have a wrong motivation, nor did Sarah. They had a very pure motivation in that sense.
So from God's point of view, couldn't that be seen as lack of faith? Because God said, you're going to have descendants. And he didn't say with Sarah, so maybe that's right. But if they're getting old and they're doubting, then he's saying, okay, let's do it with Hagar.
Well, that's the thing. As I said, in those days, it was acceptable to have a child with the maid, and then that child would have belonged to Sarah.
Yeah.
So in those days, it wasn't a lack of faith. In those days, that was just the accepted custom.
But I mean, from God's point of view, saying you and Sarah will have a child, and then getting old and not happening, then suddenly trying to force it some other way. Couldn't God see that as a losing faith in His promise?
But I don't think so, no, because as I said, that wasn't the way they thought about it in those days. Because Sarah couldn't have one, but if she could have one through her maid, that in those days was the same as her having one herself. It's just, in those days, that's the way it was. So in that sense, I don't think so. It was just, I guess they were taking the initiative. They were thinking, well, how is God going to do it? Maybe this is the way that God's going to do it. Maybe this is the way. I'm sure they prayed about it and thought about it a lot. I don't think it's a lack of faith. I don't think it was at all, as we'll see. And so when Hagar then became pregnant, then Hagar started to show contempt for Sarah. She started to say to Sarah, look, I've done your work. You weren't able to provide Abraham with a child. I become pregnant. I'm going to provide Abraham with a child. And she was thinking to herself, I'm going to replace you, and Abraham's going to love me more than he loves you. And so you can read in the Bible, she showed a lot of contempt for Sarah. And you can imagine this must have really hurt Sarah. And so Sarah then treated Hagar harshly. And then Hagar decided to run away into the desert. And then an angel appeared to Hagar and told Hagar that she should go back to Abraham and Sarah, and that she would have a son, and that her son was going to be called Ishmael, and that God was going to bless her son. That's the tradition, that she was Pharaoh's daughter, a princess, yeah.
Technically speaking, Ishmael is from a royal line.
Yes.
In a secular sense.
Yes. Yes, because Pharaoh had this vision, this revelation that Abraham was a prophet of God. So from his point of view, it was a great honor for his daughter to become the servant of... Yeah?
We think of Hagar so much as being a slave, so like lowly, but in reality.
Yes, and so you can imagine for her, it must have been really difficult. She was brought up in the palace of the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh's daughter, and suddenly she ends up becoming the maid, living in a tent with... And so you can imagine, on the one hand, she was thinking like this, but on the other hand, she was, the maid. And so you can imagine, it was really difficult for her. But then she saw, well, now she's become pregnant. She thought, well, now perhaps I can supplant Sarah in Abraham's affections, and I can become the number one wife in that sense. In that sense, become a real princess. So I can imagine she must have been going through all sorts of difficulties herself, going from the princess, the daughter of the Pharaoh, to the maid of Sarah. So, lots of things to be restored. Anyway, and then Ishmael was born. So, Abraham and Hagar then had a son called Ishmael. And Hagar then was like Abraham's concubine, I guess. Anyway, 13 years later, then God spoke to Abraham again. And he said, I will bless Sarah, and I'll give you a son by her. And she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall come from her. So up until this point, it wasn't clear that Sarah was going to have a child. God said to Abraham, you will have your descendants to number the stars of heaven, but it wasn't clear from where those descendants would come. Up until this point here, when God said that Sarah would have a child, a son. At this stage, Abraham's 99 years old and Sarah's 90 years old. So what do you think? So Sarah overheard this, and what do you think she thought?
Pulling my leg.
Yes. And so in the Bible it says that Sarah laughed. Yeah? She thought, this is hilarious, I'm old, and, am I really going to, have pleasure with my husband again? So she laughed. And it was a joke. Anyway, she became pregnant, and she gave birth to Isaac.
Isaac means laughter.
That's right, which means laughter. Anyway, so Ishmael and Isaac were growing up together. And then Sarah saw, it's not in the Bible, but it's in the Talmud, it says that Sarah saw Ishmael mistreating Isaac. And Sarah thought to herself, Abraham's really old. I'm really old. Maybe we're both going to die before Hagar dies. And maybe then Ishmael will inherit everything from Abraham. Or maybe even Ishmael will kill Isaac. So she had all these kind of ideas. And so she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son. For the son of this slave woman shall not be the heir with my son Isaac. So she is afraid, the possibility. She could see that, one was Cain, one was Abel. She could see the possibility there of this Cain-Abel relationship and Ishmael killing Isaac, and Ishmael then inheriting everything instead of Isaac. So she felt the only way out of the situation is for, Hagar and Ishmael to be sent away. And then
if you know the story, Wuthering Heights, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
Heathcliff takes the brother's son and subjugates him and takes his inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
Heathcliff is a doctor.
Sure, that's right, yeah. And and so you can see here Sarah's, kind of concern. So what do you think Abraham said to Sarah? Did Abraham want to do this?
No, that's probably what he had to.
No, he didn't want to. He thought this was a bad idea. He wanted to keep Ishmael. Abraham really loved Ishmael. Yes, his son. And he's very attached to Ishmael. And so he argued with God about it and said to God, why can't, you bless Ishmael as well? Anyway, and he had a long discussion with God about it. Then God said to him, what did God say to him?
Did God tell Abraham to send Ishmael, or did Sarah tell him?
Well, it's Sarah's idea. Said to Abraham, and Abraham didn't want to do it. Then Abraham argued with God about it and said, why can't you bless Ishmael, and why can't we keep Ishmael here as well?
Don't you think God was siding with Sarah in that idea?
So do you know what did God tell Abraham? It's very interesting. God said to Abraham, listen to your wife. Listen to your wife. Yes? Very interesting, isn't it? Listen to your wife. In other words, do what your wife says. She knows what's best. And, after many years of experience, do you think that's true, Savaya? Yeah, generally speaking. Anyway, but God said to Abraham, I will bless Ishmael and make him fruitful, and he shall be the father of 12 princes, and I'll make him a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac. So the providential covenant is going to continue through Isaac, but still God was going to bless Ishmael. And so what should have happened then, if Abraham had made the foundation of faith, then the foundation of faith could have been inherited by Isaac. Then Isaac could have stood as a central figure in the foundation of substance as Abel, and Ishmael in the position of Cain. But because Abraham didn't restore the foundation of faith, then it wasn't possible for Isaac then to stand in the position of Abel, and so it wasn't possible for the foundation of substance to be restored between Isaac and Ishmael. And so Ishmael and Hagar were sent away, and then from Isaac then come the Jewish people and Christians, and then from Ishmael come the Arabs. So this sort of conflict you see in the Middle East today is in that sense a sort of family conflict, a sort of resentment of Hagar and Ishmael being kicked out into the desert. There's still kind of this tension in this relationship between the Jews and Arabs. Anyway, so as I said, Hagar and Ishmael went out into the desert, and then they settled down. And then many, many years later, Abraham, after Sarah had died, then Abraham was wonder what happened to Ishmael, my son Ishmael. And so he got on his camel and he went off into the desert and he found Ishmael. And he found Ishmael had settled down, was prospering and doing really well. And then together, Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, the first house of the worship of God. So what's the Kaaba? The Kaaba.
It's like a temple in for Muslims.
That's right. So in Mecca, in the center of Mecca, there's this large black building in the shape of a cube. So where the English word cube comes from, Kaaba. And so this is built, most of our mathematical language comes from Arabic. Like algebra and things like this. Anyway, it's Abraham and Ishmael then, they built the Kaaba, the first house of the worship of God, as it says here in the Quran. As Abraham raised the foundation of the shrine, Together with Ishmael, they prayed, "Our Lord, accept this from us, you, the hearer, the omniscient." And so in that sense, it becomes part of, the story continues there through Islam. So I'll look at another time. Okay, so Abraham still needs to restore the foundation of faith. Yeah, the foundation of the Messiah still needs to be made, and so God gives Abraham a second chance to restore the foundation of faith. And then God says to Abraham, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I'll make my covenant with you." So, what do you think about that little statement there? "I'm God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I'll make my covenant with you." What do you say?
Have faith.
Okay, have faith. What does it say? "I am God Almighty. Walk before me." What does that mean, walk before me?
Usually you expect him to say, "Follow me."
That's right. Does God say to Abraham, "Follow me"? Does he? He says, "Walk before me." So who's following who? And be blameless. So how does Abraham know what to do then, if he's not following God? How does he know what to do?
The same way he figured out who God was.
Yes.
He thinks about it.
Okay. What's he following then? What's he listening to? His conscience. Yeah, be blameless. In other words, don't do anything wrong. Just listen to your conscience and follow your conscience, and don't do anything you know is wrong. If you don't do anything you think is wrong, you can't be blamed. To be blameless, just listen to your conscience, follow your conscience. Yes? Walk before me, follow your conscience. In other words, you have to work out for yourself what you should do. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have to work it out for yourself. In order to work it out for yourself, it means you have to listen to your conscience. That means you have to be in touch with yourself, the deepest part of yourself. Not just thinking, working it all out here, but you have to be in touch with the deeper part of yourself, intuitively knowing, this is what I should do, this is where I should go, yes? Listening to this voice speaking within oneself. And then I'll make my covenant with you. So covenant is an agreement based upon promises. So God made certain promises to Abraham, and Abraham needed to do certain things as part of his side of the covenant, or part of his side of the agreement. So God said to Abraham, "Your descendants will number the stars of heaven." So that's God's promise to Abraham. Has that promise come true? You have to remember, this is 4,000 years ago.
Not yet.
That his descendants will number the stars of heaven, yeah.
Sorry?
You said his descendants will number the stars of heaven.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And
Yeah.
whether it's come true or not.
Has it?
Not yet.
Well,
Okay, how many? All right. Okay, how many descendants of Abraham are there in the world today?
Maximum 7 billion. If everyone was.
Okay, there aren't. Anyway, if you add up the descendants of Abraham are Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
yes.
So that comes to about 4 or 5 billion people alive in the world today. Yes, and we think about it historically, there are billions of people who are the descendants of Abraham. Yeah. So again, this is a promise made 4,000 years ago to Abraham, a single man without any children, apart from Ishmael, and that promise came true. It has been fulfilled in that sense.
You mean not literally same number of stars? It's more than 5 billion stars.
Anyway, if you actually look into, if you don't have a radio telescope and all this sort of modern technical stuff, and you actually just look into the sky with your naked eye, there aren't hundreds of billions. But still, it's more than one can number.
Yeah.
So it's numberless in that sense.
But what I'm going to say something very controversial, really. In sense that, well, I always feel story of Abraham is incomplete.
What?
The story of Abraham is incomplete.
Yes.
The way the Bible talks about it, because Abraham created 3 lineages, not 2. He produced the lineage with Hagar, who gave birth to the Ishmaelites. Then he produced the lineage with Sarah, who produced the Jewish people. Then Abraham, in his old age, took a 3rd bride, Keturah. And I believe Keturah had around 6 sons. And these sons were supposed to have moved east.
Yes.
And I'm going to be more controversial and say this already. I believe that when proper research is done, we will discover that the Koreans actually come from the lineage of Abraham and Keturah. There are many people.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And this is why, because I'm sure yourself and many of our church leaders know this point really, basically. But I think we need to bring this thing out at some point anyway, basically,
yes, so, it's often thought that maybe that Keturah was Hagar, or maybe another woman, we don't know.
I think it's a different woman, isn't it? Because Keturah was a young woman, and she gave back to another 6 sons as well.
Anyway, there's speculation. Some Jewish rabbis say that Keturah is just another name for Hagar.
Really?
But anyway, yes, she had other children, and there are some people who say that these other children went on to found other religions that you find in the East, in India, and further east as well, other tribes. Yes, and so.
Yes.
Well, that's.
And I just feel the way I look at it and I think to myself, first lineage of the Arabs, the lineage of Syria for the Jews, and I think that the 3rd.
All right.
Anyway, of Second Advent, I think.
As I said, that's speculation because we haven't got any texts or any books which actually say this. It's just.
Sorry, that's why I said.
It's just.
I mentioned the word controversial.
It's not controversial. It's just speculation. That's all. Nobody knows. There's no evidence in that sense. There are no scriptures that make that connection. Yeah. It's just speculation that maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's unprovable one way or the other. So the father of many nations. So is Abraham the father of many nations?
Yes.
Such as?
Israel.
Yeah.
Arab countries.
Yeah, all the Arab countries, all the Muslim countries, all the Christian countries, all the countries of Europe, the Middle East, Africa, North America, South America, and some countries in Asia. These now are all the literal or spiritual descendants of Abraham. So, father of many nations. It's an everlasting covenant. So the covenant is still there 4,000 years later. God said, your descendants will live in the land of Canaan. Yeah, who lives in the land of Canaan today? Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And God said to him, I'll make a sign of the covenant with you, which is circumcision. And so, do you think Abraham liked the idea? So God said to Abraham, you and all your descendants should be circumcised. This is a sign of the covenant. Do you think Abraham liked that idea? Why not? Sorry? That wasn't why he didn't like it. What was Abraham doing? What was his task? What was he? He was a religious leader. He was witnessing, telling people about God. I think, again, it's just my speculation, I think what you find in Genesis, the story about the creation of the universe in 6 days, and the story of Adam and Eve, I think this is Abraham's teaching, what Abraham was teaching. He had many, many followers. So God said, you and all your descendants should be circumcised. What do you think Abraham said? He didn't dislike the idea because he didn't mind being circumcised himself. But he said, well, I'm here to tell people about you, and if the condition for people to join your religion and to follow me is they should be circumcised, is this going to increase the number? Is this going to increase the number of people who are going to join or reduce it? Yes. So Abraham argued with God, said to God, look, if everybody has to join this religion, it has to be circumcised, it's not such a great witnessing tool strategy. It's not making it any easier. And so they had a bit of an argument. And anyway, he argued that to command us, was too difficult. And anyway, so God said to Abraham, "You have no defect but this foreskin. Remove it, and the defect will be gone. And hence walk before me and be whole." So here we've got an idea that through being circumcised, then Abraham was becoming complete. And are you interested in the meaning of circumcision?
I think the drinking blood of people, is it?
Yeah, there's more to it than that. It's very interesting, actually.
Yes.
And if you look at the Hebrew, the word for foreskin is olah, and it's also, that word also means a tree, and so yes.
It's kind of a branch.
Yes, branch, a tree. Anyway, so by extension, if it refers to tree, then it refers to, what does a tree bear? A tree bears fruit, and then through a male sexual organ is the way through which you multiply and bear fruit. So these are connections. And so God said to Abraham, "I will make my covenant between me and you, and I'll multiply you exceedingly. Therefore, with that member through which I'll multiply you exceedingly, I will make my covenant between you and me and you." In other words, then, the covenant that God made with Abraham was a covenant with Abraham's sexual organ, which is interesting when you think about what Father talks about sexual organ. Actually, this is the sort of biblical understanding as well, that the covenant that God made with Abraham, he made this covenant with his sexual organ. And so it's interesting. Also, all Hebrew letters, they all have a particular number assigned to them. So if you look at this stage, Abraham, his name was Abram, A-B-R-A-M, and in the Hebrew, the letter A is assigned the numerical value of 1, the letter B the numerical value of 2, R 200, and M 40. And so if you add the numbers up for Abram as name, it comes to 243. And Jewish anatomy, they say that the human body has 248 limbs. Yes, not, by a limb, I mean, if you break down all the muscles and everything, and the organs and everything, it says 248 limbs or organs within a human body. And so they said before he was circumcised, Abraham had control over 243 limbs. And then when God made this covenant with Abraham, he then changed his name from Abram to Abraham. In other words, he gave him a ha, an extra letter, an H. And in Hebrew, H is worth 5. And so this brought the numerical value of his name up to 248. And so he said, now, after being circumcised, Abraham had control over 248 of his limbs. In other words, complete mind-body unity. So what do you think these extra 5 limbs were then?
Spiritual senses.
No.
One of them is obvious.
Okay, they say it was the 2 eyes, because often, it's through, so that instead of looking in the wrong way and being tempted, he would only look in the right way. He'd never be tempted by whatever he saw. Yes, another 2 things were his ears. So whatever he heard, he would never hear gossip, or he'd never listen to things in the wrong way. And the 5th one was his sexual organ. So he had complete control over his sexual organ. And so that's the way the rabbis interpret it, which is very interesting. And
Yes, it's a
and so it's really, anyway, so that's the idea of the covenant. And so, as I said, it's also like a sign of the covenant. So often when people, want to indicate which group they belong to, they might have a T-shirt saying, whatever, or they might have you still belong to North London Heart, yes, loyalty. Or they may have a scarf on of the football team they support. Yes. Or if they belong to a gang, they may put tattoos on. And so that's what people often do. They often, through the way in which they clothe themselves, the designer labels they choose, is the way in which they express who they are, their identity. The way people dress, or the tattoos they put on, or whatever. This is the way in which people express their identity, which expresses which particular group they belong to, which particular group they associate with. So if you're a goth, you don't walk around with bright-coloured clothes, do you? It's just a contradiction in terms. If you want to be a goth, then you wear a particular kind of clothing, and you have your hair in a certain kind of way, etc., etc. It's the way it is. And so if you want to belong to Abraham's gang, or God's gang, instead of putting a tattoo here, you would cut off your foreskin. And that was the way in which you became initiated into God's gang. This became your badge of identity. It showed who you were, to whom you belong. And it was something very, very clear. So when you all go into the gents or into a bath together, it becomes very clear who's Jew or Muslim and who isn't.
Actually, people have moved on from tattoos to actual body modification. It starts under the skin or
Yeah.
the scars. So.
All sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, in Africa often they, put certain things like this, and all sorts of things in which people do that sort of thing. Anyway, for Jews, that was the way they would do it, circumcise their foreskin. And, sometimes for Jewish people, that was at the risk of their life. Because very often Jews have been persecuted. And so when they were thinking, if we circumcise our son, that means everybody will know he is Jewish. It means he cannot hide who he is. And if he happens to be living in a period or a time when Jews are being persecuted, there's no escape. So in that sense, at the risk of their life, they're affirming their identity in God. At the risk of my life, we belong to God's side. Yeah? You can't hide. Yeah? As that's the way in which this lineage was passed on from generation to generation, changing the blood lineage at the risk of their life. As we looked at before, Father said we change our lineage at the risk of our life. And that's what Jewish people have done through this circumcision. They've been affirming that they are on God's side, and sometimes, because of that, they'd be discriminated against, they could lose their job, they could lose their life. But, for them, who they were is more important than anything. They're affirming their identity as the sons and daughters of God. The circumcision then was said, but God said this is the everlasting sign of the covenant, between you and all your descendants for eternity. And so that's why our Jews are circumcised. The boys are circumcised when? When a Jewish boy is circumcised? On the 8th day. When do we have our 8 days set? Giving it away. When do we have our dedication ceremony for our blessed children? On the 8th day. Following that tradition. Yes. And Muslims also, they circumcised. So Ishmael was also circumcised. Isaac was circumcised when he was 8 days old. Ishmael was circumcised when he was about 13 years old. And so Muslims, they circumcise, boys are circumcised when they're, early teens. And for them it's a big thing. And they have a big party, and it's a matter of pride that goes snip, and they don't show any fear or any pain. And it's a big party, a big celebration, like a coming of age, where you're showing that you're a man. Yes? Yep.
Oh, just a certain one.
No, as far as I know, they all are. Because this is the tradition of through Abraham. And also, lots of Christians are also circumcised, but it's not for religious reasons, generally speaking. Because Paul came along and said, actually, it's not necessary for Gentiles to be circumcised. So Paul was trying to make it easy for people to accept Christ. There were lots, and I said, in the Roman Empire, about 5 to 10% of the people living in the Roman Empire were Jews. They weren't all literally descendants of Jacob, because a lot of them were converts. And so a lot of people were converting to Judaism at that time, because the Roman religion was very vacuous, very superficial. It had no spiritual or moral teaching. And the people with the deepest and most profound spiritual and moral teaching in the ancient world were the Jews. And so people were very attracted towards the synagogue, And a lot of people became Jews, but in order to become a Jew, you had to be circumcised. And so a lot of men thought, well, yes, maybe not. And so St. Paul, when he's telling people about becoming a Christian, you could actually believe in Jesus and you could become part of God's chosen people without being circumcised. Yeah? Whereas the original followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, said, if you want to become a Christian, you have to be circumcised. But then St. Paul said, actually, it's not necessary for Gentiles to be circumcised. Yeah, just the circumcision of the heart, which is in itself is an Old Testament idea. He said that's all necessary. Yeah, you don't need to physically be circumcised. And so, of course, it was like Judaism light. Yeah, easy Judaism. And so that's why, generally speaking, Christians aren't circumcised, certainly not for religious reasons, because of St. Paul. But Jews and Muslims are. Okay, so God also made promises to Sarah. And God said to Sarah, you'll have a son, and you'll be the mother of many nations. So, one of the interesting things about the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, is women have a very important role. It's not all through the men. God speaks to women as well. Women also have, God told Abraham, listen to your wife, God gave promises to Sarah, and also lots of other women in the Bible. They also have important roles as well. Because it's all to do with restoring everything. Okay, so, whoops, did I skip something there? No, that's right. Okay, so we'll see what happened next. Anyway, so after God made this covenant with Abraham, then God said to Abraham, look, Abraham, time for this? Yeah, I think so. I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because they're really wicked cities. Now, this isn't wicked in the modern sense of the word. They weren't really, how do you do it? Wicked? They weren't really that kind of wicked. They were just, really bad people. And there used to be lots of robberies and murder and theft and rape and lots of bad stuff used to go on in these cities. Anyways, Abraham himself was living not very far away from these cities. And Abraham was a righteous person, a good person. He was witnessing. But you can imagine the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, when they came across Abraham, they'd mock Abraham, make fun of him. They go and scratch his car. They go and, put stuff through his letterbox and, generally be a complete pain. A bit like living in the middle of, some kind of, housing estates. Anyway, God said to Abraham, look, Abraham, I'm going to go and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because they're really bad places. So what would you expect Abraham to say in response?
Oh, go on the mountain and watch from a distance.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes you're living in the world and you look at the world, we feel, why is it the evil people do so well? There's no justice in this world. And supposing, you were living in a particular house and living a good life and being nice to all your neighbours, but there's a particular gang of people who used to come around teasing you and throwing tomatoes at your house and making fun of you and scratching your car and putting stuff through your letterbox and beating up your children and bullying them at school and everything. And then one day, you had a dream, and God said to you in the dream, those families over there that are really so badly behaved, actually tonight there's been a gas leak and their houses are going to go up in smoke and they're all going to be blown up and going to be dead. How might you feel? You might feel, yes, justice at last. They're going to get what they deserve. Yeah? That's a sort of normal, in that sense, kind of reaction people often feel. But what's so extraordinary about Abraham is he didn't react like that at all. Actually, he was, extraordinary person. And he said to God, he said to God, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Shall not the judge of the earth do right? So Abraham, then he challenged God and said, God, is that really godlike? Is that really fair to destroy those cities? Supposing there's 100 good people there, will you destroy the good people along with the bad people? And God said no. And then Abraham bargained with God. Well, supposing there's 95 good people there. And he argued with God and got it all the way down to 10 good people. And finally, God said, okay, if there's 10 good people, then I won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. So what was Abraham demonstrating here? He loved his enemies. He didn't want bad things to happen to his enemies. He didn't want bad things to happen to all these wicked people. He had the heart that he wanted to go and witness to these people and save their lives. He wanted to save their lives. He didn't want them to be destroyed. He didn't want them to be judged. He didn't want them to be punished. He actually had the heart to want to go and witness to them and to save them. And he didn't want God to go and punish them. So, how can you imagine arguing with God in that way? Supposing Father, one day, got into a furious temper and said that particular person or group over there, they should be punished and kicked out and prosecuted and this and everything else. And you thought, that's not fair. I don't think that's right. What would you do? Would you stand up and challenge Father and say, Father, that's not fair. You're supposed to be the true Father of all human beings, of all humanity. I don't think it's right to do that.
Yeah.
You would. Good. Good for you. But that's the reality. Abraham was that kind of person. He was willing to argue with God at the risk of his life. Yeah? It's kind of a scary thing to do, to go and to argue with somebody who's incredibly powerful and you think they're wrong. Yeah, it's not what normal people do, is it? Yeah? That's what Abraham did. Anyway, so Abraham had a plan, actually. He had a plan. He had, in his mind, he knew that there were, or what he thought were 10 good people. So Abraham's family was known to be a very hospitable family. They were known for this quality of hospitality. Whenever anybody came by, they'd always invite them in and serve them food, look after them, take care of them. So when these angels came along, strangers came along, they always took care of strangers. And they always had this quality and this heart of hospitality towards strangers and loving their enemies. Yes, and always welcoming those kind of people. So that was like the family tradition, which again you find in the Middle East still today. Anyway, so Abraham was thinking, well, Lot, my nephew, he's living just outside Sodom. And he's married, and I know Lot and his wife, they're good people. And he's got 4 daughters, and I know his daughters are also good people. And I know 2 of his daughters are married, and I'm sure they've got good husbands, and 2 of the other daughters are engaged. I'm sure they've also got good fiancés. And so Abraham in his mind had 10 people he thought were good people. On that account of Lot's family thought, then the city can be preserved and protected. Anyway, so let's see what happened. Anyway, so the angels then, they went down to see if they could find 10 good people. And they went into Sodom, and Lot met them at the gate. He happened to be standing at the gate, and his tradition was to be hospitable. 2 strangers had come into town, so he invited them round for dinner. And then, that wasn't the tradition of Sodom, though. When those strangers came into town, normally what they did was they mugged them and robbed them. That was the normal tradition. There was like a sort of huge organised crime network there. But anyway, Lot invited them in for dinner and said to his wife, "You've got a couple of strangers in for dinner, can you make a little bit of extra food?" And Lot's wife said, "Yes, I'd love to, but haven't quite got enough food." So she went next door, said to a neighbour, "We've got a couple of strangers in for dinner tonight." And the neighbour said, "So can I borrow a little bit of extra food to feed them?" And her neighbour said, "Strangers? We don't feed strangers, Anyway, so the next door neighbour went and told the local police, that these, well, not exactly police, but the local people running the city, that there were strangers in. And so they came round to visit Lot. Anyway, the angels, though, they're sitting around having dinner with Lot and his family, and the angels said to Lot and his family, God is going to destroy this city unless there are 10 righteous people. And then the 2 husbands there, they said, well, actually the 4 men there, the 2 husbands and the 2 fiancés said, "What a load of rubbish. We don't believe in God. What are you talking about?" And they were incredibly hostile to the angels and the message from God that the angels had brought.
Did they know they were angels?
No. They were just hostile. They were just citizens of Sodom.
So did they know that they were talking to angels when they seemed they don't believe in God?
No.
So the angels kind of disguised.
Yes, it doesn't say angels, they're just, yeah. They were just, I mean, it just says in the Bible that 3 men came to talk to Abraham. God came and there were 3 men with him, and it's traditionally understood that these 3 men were angels. So these angels, when they appeared, they didn't appear as these bright things, because naturally, if an angel appeared which is all bright and shining, naturally you would listen to what it was saying. So angels often come unawares, disguised to see what you really like. Yes, as opposed to, you know what I mean? This idea of, you entertaining angels when you don't know it. Anyway, so what happened next is that, the local mob came round and they banged on Lot's door and said, Lot, who are those strangers that you got in there? Send them out to us so that we can know them. In other words, so that we can rob them and we can rape them. And Lot went to the door and said, that's outrageous. What a terrible thing to do. What bad manners you guys have got. How can you possibly do that? These are my guests. These strangers are my guests. And then they said to Lot, well, if you don't do it, if you don't let them out, we're going to go and do the same thing to your whole family. We're going to mug you all, rape you all, rob you all, and kill you all, the whole family. And then Lot said, okay, look, I'll give you... Look, this is what I'll do instead. I've got 2 daughters who are virgins. I'll send you out my 2 virgin daughters, and you can do whatever you like to them, but don't mistreat my guests. So what do you think about that?
Sacrificial.
It's hard to understand.
Was that moral?
Technically, but
What law was Lot following? What is the law of hospitality? Put your guests before yourself. So if you invite people around for dinner and there's not enough food, who gets fed and who doesn't get fed?
The guest gets fed.
The guests get fed, even if it means that you say, well, actually we ate earlier, we're not hungry. Yes? Or, if your children invite friends round, who should you give the best ice cream to or the most cake to?
The guests.
The guests, yeah? That's just the law of hospitality. You give the best to your guests. And if you haven't got enough, it means that you don't eat, but you make sure that your guests eat. Yes? You offer your guests your best bed. You offer your guests the best that you have. That's hospitality. That's normal. But here, we're in a very extreme situation. So Lot has to make a decision. What am I going to do? The law of hospitality is that I should sacrifice my family to protect for the sake of these guests, for the sake of these strangers. Yeah, that was the law of hospitality. And so that's what he did. And because he did that, do you know what happened next? Then the angels, they then went, after Lot had made his offered to do this, and then the angels, they went to the door, they opened the door, and they got out their Harry Potter wands, and they struck all the mob blind, and they all wandered off, like zombies, couldn't see anything anymore. Yeah? So because Lot then made this condition, then it was a condition which meant that God was able to intervene and act and protect Lot and his family. If, on the other hand, Lot hadn't done that, then God wouldn't have been able to protect his family, and they probably all would have been wiped out. These kind of things, life can turn on these sort of things. Scary. So, this is what it says here. There's only one way to recover this lineage and ownership. This was a path to win the natural subjugation of Satan, to have Satan surrender voluntarily. It can only be accomplished by the power of true love when we love our enemies more than we love our children. We love our enemies more than we love our children. And that was the principle that Lot was following. Yeah? That was the way through which he could change his lineage. That was the tradition of Abraham's family. The whole family had this tradition of loving their enemies more than they loved their children, living for the sake of others. Now you can see this is the tradition that fathers practice. Yeah? always, eating breakfast, lunch and dinner with all sorts of guests and church leaders, and very, very rarely, for many, many decades actually, taking the time to be able to have breakfast, lunch and dinner with his own children. It's very sad actually, but that's what he did. Okay. And then, anyway.
So why did God still destroy Sodom and Gomorrah when there was obviously some righteous people?
Well, there weren't 10, you see. There was Lot and his wife and the 4 daughters. So there was only 6. There weren't 10. So the condition wasn't made.
So there were 2 husbands, not 4 husbands.
Right. And so what? Okay. So the angel said, "Look, I'm sorry, but these husbands and fiancés, they're faithless. Therefore." And so the angel said to Lot, "Your family better escape because now God is going to destroy the city." And so Lot and his wife and 2 daughters, they fled. And the angel said, "Don't turn back." So they fled and they left the city and went into the mountains. And so the 2 daughters that went were the 2 unmarried daughters. But the 2 daughters that stayed behind, they stayed because they were trying to persuade their husbands to come with them. But their husbands didn't, and so they ended up getting trapped and stuck there. And so the angel said to Lot's family, "Don't turn around and look back." But Lot's wife turned around, and the Bible says she was turned into a pillar of salt. So what do you think that means? Do you think is it literally possible to turn into a pillar of salt? So what do you think that represents then, or symbolises?
Tears or something.
Why did she turn around? Yeah, she's worried about her 2 other daughters. Okay. And anything else?
She's pulled. Some part of her wants her home. She wants.
Yes, she's
attached
she's attached to her 2 daughters who stayed behind. She's attached to her home. She's attached to all of this, and so she's looking back in that sense with regret, and so she's attached to it. And if you become attached to the past, then what happens? Sometimes you say people get stuck in the past. Yeah, can't move forwards, and you get stuck in the past. Sometimes you become eaten up with resentment and bitterness, and salt is very bitter in that sense. And so when it says she was turned into a pillar of salt, it meant her character became very salty in that sense, very bitter and resentful, and living in the past, living with regret, living with accusations, living with why, etc., etc. And so because of this, then she couldn't move forwards. Yeah, and she gets stuck. Her spiritual development was stuck. In that sense, she turned into a pillar of salt. So again, there's a lesson there as well. You need to, not to become attached to things or to people in that sense, but to be able to let go and to move on, to release from this and to move on. Because otherwise, you get stuck. I remember there's one person who joined the church in sort of 1979, I think it was, very young man, about 17 or 18 years old, but he's always, always seemed to be, angry and resentful. And so I was talking to him, "What's the matter?" He said, "Well, my whole life was brilliant, and I had this motor scooter, and I was going around on my motor scooter with my friends, and then I had an accident. My motor scooter got written off. I broke my leg, and I can't afford another motor scooter, and I can't go out with my friends anymore. My whole life now is ruined." And I thought, "You're 17 years old." But he would, and it was like this for months. And I felt, gosh, his whole life is ahead of him, but he feels because of this little thing, his whole life is being ruined. In other words, instead of going this direction, now his whole life is going in that direction, and that's it, it's finished, Excuse me, just turn it off. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's, these sort of things you can, get from these kind of stories. And, yeah, so there we are. So that's what happened.
Can you just make it a bit more clear, because I'm still struggling with this concept of loving your
Yeah.
Because there's two ways to love. One is the actual emotions you generate in your heart.
Mm.
Naturally, people love their children more than anything else.
Mm.
The other one is the actions you take. So loving can be described as what you do.
Yes.
You give attention, you give
Yes.
things.
Mm.
But surely Father doesn't actually love Satan more than he loves his own children. As far as the feeling he has in his heart.
I don't know. Who can tell? But anyway, at the end of the day, you know, your children invite their friends round for tea, and of course you love your own children more than you love their friends. But, and so for me, the most, if I can really broadcast this, switch off for a moment. Anyway, for me, one of the most difficult experiences when I was a child was when I had a friend come round for tea, and my mother gave me the biggest piece of cake. Yeah?
Your mum gave you the biggest.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then that's because my mother loves me more than I deserve, to be perfectly honest. And because of this, then she did that. And I felt really embarrassed. I felt kind of, no, it shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't, you know what I mean?
How old is it?
I don't know, 5 or 6, 7, something like that. But I just remember, I felt it was burning, you know, felt this isn't right, you know, you should actually, anyway, that's all I can say. And so in that sense, she really loved me far more than this person, but she had to be able to deny that and do that, and that was really difficult. And so it's not an easy thing to do, but that is that's the law of hospitality.
When I was 15, I went to my friend's house. My friend and I went to his uncle's house. And I and he went into the living room. And the uncle poured him a glass of lemon juice to give to him. And I just stood there and he didn't even offer me.
Yeah.
I was really shocked.
Yes. And so, you know, so in that sense, if you actually loved your children's friends more than you loved your own children, and it was in that sense, it would be easy to do that. Yeah? But actually it's not easy to do that. It means going against what you would really like to do. And so, you know, we talk about Father loving, you know, if he genuinely actually loved and liked ordinary members and guests more than his own children, then that would be easy. And it would even be, I would say, wrong.
Yeah, right.
Because it's not natural. But it's the fact that you have this overwhelming love for this person, but you do it for that person. That's the painful thing. That is, in that sense, going the way of the cross. Yeah? And that's what it means, overcoming the temptation to put your family above the society. Yeah? So, yeah. Okay, just one last bit, and because this will be the natural break. Then, anyway, so in order to restore the foundation of faith, then Abraham, or maybe we can leave this till next week. Anyway, it's quite simple. Went through the same thing as he went through with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. Went to Gerar. Abraham said to Sarah, just pretend you're my sister. Abimelech invited Sarah in for tea, stayed the night. And again, Sarah had the temptation to become married to the king or carry on with his, Abraham. She overcame that temptation. She purified herself. And so Abraham was able to reclaim Sarah from Abimelech. It's like Adam restoring Eve from Lucifer. And Abimelech also gave them lots of slaves and lots of wealth. And so Sarah then was the most remarkable person. She overcame these kind of temptations, restored the position of Eve. And she was the mother of Israel, an incredibly hospitable person. Just loving all the beggars and the strangers and everybody that used to come to her home. She always embraced them and fed them and took care of them. And there was this very bright light over her inside and over her tent. And her tent door was always open. She had this kind of character, a very wonderful person. Okay, stop there. Not very many questions today, but it's all right. Yes?
Why did this restitution process, why did you have to have it twice? Is there any particular reason? Why Sarah had to go through this process twice?
Well, yes, because this is for the second chance. So the first time was restoring the foundation of faith the first time around, but then because Abraham didn't make the offering correctly, then is restoring the foundation of faith a second time around, which means you've got to again restore this situation
Oh, really?
because it's the second time round, so they've got to go through it all over again.
Oh, I see.
That's then offering his son.
Yes, and then after that, it's offering the son, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
which will come to next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks.